Hello, everyone, and welcome to the North Carolina Botanical Gardens Lunchbox Talks for today. I'm Joanna Lalikas, and I'm the Director of Education at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. We're so glad to have you here with us. The North Carolina Botanical Garden and the North Carolina Botanical Garden Foundation acknowledge that the story told about the history of the land we steward has been incomplete. Before the Morgans and Masons, these lands were home to multiple tribes and the ancestors of the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation, who are thriving locally to this day. We celebrate the Native people today, including many UNC students, faculty, and staff who still gather, walk, hike, and engage with the habitats and gardens on these lands. We recognize that at least one of the adjacent lands we steward, Mason Farm Biological Reserve, was first cleared, cultivated, and worked by Native Americans and later by enslaved people of African descent. We invite you to reflect on our individual and community roles in knowing the whole story about the land we each steward. I'm thrilled to offer today's program in partnership with the Friends of Plant Conservation. We've partnered with them again this year to offer pairings of lunchbox talks and excursions to some of North Carolina's most beautiful state natural areas. Today's talk is the first of several paired programs this spring. Our paired excursion for this program will be held on Friday, March 18th, and participants will visit the Pondberry Bay Plant Conservation Preserve in Sampson County. Joel Rose is the executive director of the Sampson County History Museum Complex in Clinton, as well as an active member of the Friends of the Sampson County Waterways, which is a nonprofit group that promotes clean waterways and recreational paddling in the local creeks and rivers of the area. So thank you for joining us today, Joel. I'll ask you now to unmute and David will share your presentation.
Okay. Hello, Joanna, and hello, everyone. Well, I'm doing a story today on naval stores and the longleaf pine industry of North Carolina. I did a closer look. Our longleaf pine habitat has been somewhat destroyed over the years due to logging and the need for naval store products. But I want to tell you a little bit about its history and where it began and how it got there and where we are today. So David, if you can move it along. Okay, here's a chart showing, give you an idea of what the longleaf pine growth looked like, say, 200, 300, 400 years ago. Of course, as I mentioned, it's been decimated ever since. David? Okay, obviously it gets its name from its long needles, which can run between 8 and 10 inches, 8 and 18 inches. I really enjoy seeing as we go along a road, if you're traveling down a highway, you might see these pine trees and pine needles. They're different than other pine trees that you see. That's because they're somewhat unusual these days. But here's a stand of pine trees that someone is growing right now. And as I mentioned up there, they frequently grow them for their pine needles today. They're longer and last longer and are more desirable. Okay, let's look at these pine cones. And I'm sure you've been in some kind of a gift shop in the past where they sell these pine cones. And of course, the pine cones from the longleaf pine are showing 8, 10 inches. And you'll frequently see these in gift shops, and they'll sell for $20 or $30 for a small bag. I mean, that's crazy, but people buy them. David? Okay, here's a shot of a stand of longleafs, and this, I'm not sure where this picture was taken. Again, they can grow up to 100 feet, diameter of 28 inches. In the past, the mature forest would grow up to 150 feet with a diameter of 4 feet. Okay, now here's something you just won't see today. Now this is a mature stand of pine, of longleaf pine. possibly 300 or 400 years old. Not sure where this is taken. Obviously, you can look at it and tell it's an old photo. Now here's another one. You look at the mode of dress this lady's wearing, probably 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. Not sure where this photo was taken, but once again, this is a stand of longleaf pines. And you'll notice that you don't have a lot of ground clutter and small undergrowth. And once again, here's an old photo of an old established forest. Okay, before European settlement, these pines were the most abundant ecosystem in the North America, and only about 3% of the longleaf pine forest remains today. Now, one thing you'll notice here on part of this ground cover are saw palmettos, and if you're traveling down I-40, say to Wilmington, you might start seeing these things maybe somewhere between the Burgall exit and Wilmington once you get into Wilmington. And that is part of that area where you're going to find longleaf pine natural growth, or where, at least where it was. Okay. Beginning in the 1400s, countries began building their own navies. They explored the world, and they required a lot of wood for their sailing ships. Okay, this is just to give you an example. 1588, when the Spanish Armada was defeated by the English Navy, England had a total of 137 ships, and Spain had 130. So right there, that's over 250 wooden sailing ships that were required. Okay, and about the same time, you're starting to see worldwide travel, commercial trade, and of course, there was a greater need for sailing vessels. The demand was for new ships who were fast, capable of carrying a lot of cargo and moving faster from port to port. Okay, so what kind of items are needed to build a ship? Well, you had to have lumber, obviously. You needed turpentine. You needed tar, pitch, hemp, and straight trees. Now, the lumber had to be strong, and it had to be somewhat pliable. Turpentine was needed as a solvent and to be used like a paint thinner. Tar we'll talk about, back up there, David. Tar we'll talk about in a moment, but it was used to coat the outside of a ship. Pitch was used, pitch is actually tar that's been reprocessed and then the water evaporated from it, but it was used to seal crevices and caulks and grooves. Hemp was used for the ropes, and straight trees were used for the mast. Okay, byproducts of longleaf pine used in building wooden ships. Okay, here we go. Heart pine. I'm sure you're all familiar with heart pine, known for its durability, and it's impervious to rot, resistance to insects. Turpentine, multiple uses. Tar, again, used to coat the ship and deck, making it waterproof. Tar was also used to coat the rope to make it rot resistant. So, I mean, you can just imagine what kind of challenges you would have, if you were at sea and your ropes began to fall apart. Tar was also used to paint the sails. Now, when we look at photos and movies, the sails of a ship were always white, but in reality, they were kind of a beige color. They were painted with this tar to make them waterproof as well. Now, again, I mentioned pitch. Pitch is made from removing the moisture from from tar. It's thicker, and they mix it with both cow manure and horse manure and old pieces of rope to give it some body, and they place it in the seams between the boards of a boat or a deck. And of course, the straight trees were needed for the mast. Now here is a couple of photos of tar being applied to the wooden hull of a boat, and the second photo is what it looks like afterwards. Okay, I think David was asking and indicated he was interested in learning more about naval stores and what they were, okay? And I'm sure you probably heard the term naval stores all of your life. Well, if you're like me, I had no clue what was a naval store. What's that got to do with the Navy? But the more I learned about these things, these are products that were required for use by a Navy, okay? And this idea, this term naval store, it's like you're storing products that were used for building a Navy. So whether it's the wood or the tar or the turpentine, these items were stored together, and that's how they were described. Again, you see the definition applied to resin-based components used in building and maintaining wooden ships. Okay, David. All right, here's our friend Sir Walter Raleigh, okay? And we're all familiar with Sir Walter Raleigh and his establishment of the Lost Colony, and again, on a return trip to England, well, let me back up. England was in need of a new source. They had used up all their hardwoods. They were in need of a new source of wood for their ships. And of course, when Sir Walter Raleigh returned to England, he said, I found them. Okay, he said the Longleaf pine is perfect. They grow in abundance in the Carolinas and Virginia, and that's the solution. Okay, now it took some know-how, it took some experience to know how to extract tar from a pine tree. So there were what you'd call tar makers, and a group of them were sent in, I think, 1690 to North Carolina to develop the naval store industry. And the place where they settled eventually became the small town of Bath. I don't know if people live there anymore. It's, it's up in northeastern North Carolina. I think it's on the Pamlico River, but it became the first capital of North Carolina in 1705. Okay, this is not a very good picture, but in the early days of the colony, there were issues between the Native Americans and the colonists. And if you read your history books correctly, it was usually the colonists were interfering and taking advantage of the friendships that had developed with the Tuscarora Indians. And of course, in I think it was 1710, you had the Tuscarora War. And when that happened, they drove most of the Tuscaroras out of eastern North Carolina, and most of them went north to like New York. But it took over 100 years after that for the naval store industry to really take hold in the colonies. And of course, England was sorely dependent on the colonies as a source of wood and for the naval store products. Okay, now this is this is the right place for this one. Let's skip that one, David. Move along if you don't mind. Okay, now let me talk about the longleaf pine real quick. Let me talk about the wood itself. And here's a cross cutting, and as you'll see, the exterior part is called sapwood, and the interior is called heartwood. And the sapwood is what takes the water from the ground, the water and the nutrients. It takes it all the way to the top for the limbs and helps them grow. Now, heartwood is filled with the sticky gum-like stuff. It's a resin. And what it does, if a tree is never like nicked or damaged, like if you're out with a lawnmower, for example, and cutting grass, and you hit your pine tree and nick it and cause a cut on it, for example, it won't take long before you'll see the resin grows in to protect the tree where it's more or less wounded. Okay, again, we're talking about heart pine. And if any of you have heart pine floors at your home or know folks that do, I mean, it's greatly in demand. It's not cheap, it's long lasting. And again, it's as I show up here, it's the non-living portion of a longleaf pine. It's the centerpiece. It contains the resins. All right, okay. All right, here's a good cutaway slide of this piece. This log was probably about, I don't know, 250, 300 years old. And you can see a seedling in 1713 and all the way through World War II. And so, you know, that's 230 years right there. So I guess the age of this tree would have been around 250 plus, almost 300 years old. Okay, let's talk about the pine gum. But we call it resin. And the reason I'm including this picture so you can get a better idea, it's white, it's milky. And again, it's the most important product out of a longleaf pine. And you'll see on the right, this is a pine that's had damage and of sorts, and it's bleeding, more or less bleeding, this resin, which protects it. Okay. All right, so really you got two reasons for the resin. You've got two byproducts that you get from resin. One is turpentine. Okay, now that's made from the living resin that you drain from the tree or you scrape from the tree. And the other is the tar, and that comes out of the heartwood, the heart pine. I mean, it's there, and it's made from dead trees. Okay, here are a couple of different photos. One on the left is just showing crude turpentine. The one on the right is showing tar. You know, we think about tar, we think about the tar on the roads. Usually it's an oil base or charcoal base, a coal base byproduct, but you can also have tar coming from pine trees, and it looks similar, and it has a similar feel and texture to it. Okay, fat wood, fat lighter wood, we've all heard of that. I know on occasion I like to build a fire in my house and the fireplace, and I use some of this fat lighter wood. You can buy this stuff now, lights easily and burns. That's because it contains this flammable resin, and is still used, you know, frequently today. Okay, let's talk about this resinous wood, this lighter wood. The difference here, we're showing the photo of the tree and drawing sap out of the tree. Tar makers, these people would go around and collect limbs of the dead pine trees, and they collect them, and they build what's known as a tar kiln. And if you know the word kiln, is an oven, okay? And you hear the term kiln with pottery making and that sort of thing. Now we're going to take a look at a tar kiln. Now this is one this is a black and white photo, obviously an older photo, but what you see is a floor that's been layered with clay. And of course, they're in the process of building the tar kiln from here. Now here's another, this is a modern day photo showing the making of a tar kiln, and you see how they're packing the limbs as they are. And again, these limbs come from, not from a living tree, but from either a dead pine that's been removed, or a longleaf pine stump, or something found on the ground that's been lying there for years and years. And that's how they put together these small logs to construct the tar kiln. Okay, here's an older picture of a tar kiln. The wood has been stacked. It's ready to be covered with pine branches, and the final step is to cover with sod. Now, what you need to understand here is that with these tar kilns, they don't want to burn this wood. They want to smolder. They wanted to get it so hot that it begins to sweat. And what it sweats, what comes out of that is known as tar. Okay. And with this process, you can't see it from here, but they would dig a trench that's lower than the kiln itself. And it would be lined with clay, and it would allow the tar to drain, and it usually drain into a vat or a barrel. Now here's a picture. This is a modern day photo of a tar kiln that hasn't been lit yet, been burned, but you see it's been covered with sod. Okay, it makes it somewhat airtight. So again, it's not going to burn. They don't want flames. They want it to smolder. Okay, here's an old photo of a kiln that's been burned out and collapsed from the top. Again, this is kind of like the final step, and you can see the barrel that's dumping out. It's extracting tar out of it, and they're flowing it into a barrel here. Okay. This is an old photo. I mean, this is an old drawing, give you an idea of what it was 150 years ago or more. Men would gather, and they'd hang around, they trade lies, they drink, they tell stories, they just enjoy themselves. But you couldn't leave a tar kiln alone. You couldn't leave it unattended. Okay, it's the same picture, but it took a while to make tar. First of all, it would take at least 2 days to dig the large hole and prepare the ground by placing clay around it. It'd take 2 days to collect the wood. It'd take 2 days packing the green limbs and sod. You know, as I said, they don't want it burned. It would take 9 to 11 days, maybe longer, to smolder and extract the tar. So again, it was watched 24 hours a day and was never left unattended until the project was completed. Okay, here's another look at that the tar. And again, it was used to waterproof the sails, the ships, the ropes. They'd use it to caulk the seams. They'd even waterproof some of their clothing. I mean, somebody said it was one of the first, that was used to make the first raincoat. I don't know if that's kind of like a stretch, but you can imagine the clothing would have been waterproof as well, and probably needed by some sailors. Okay, producing turpentine. Now this is a little bit different process. Again, turpentine comes from the white resin that we were seeing on a living longleaf pine. It's white or clear in color. It's done by boxing. They create a notch in the bottom of the tree. They do it in the late winter before the sap rises. And in order to make turpentine, you have to distill it. And the remaining, after distillation, the remaining byproduct is resin. Okay, let me stop here real quick. And I just mentioned the byproduct being rosin, and there's a difference between resin and rosin. You know, resin is the milky white stuff produced by the pine, and rosin is the leftover, the remnants once the resin has been processed into turpentine. And you know, I'll explain the distillation process in a moment. Now, making turpentine, again, late winter, workers would create, they would hack an opening there at the base of the pine, and they place a trough at the bottom. Sometimes they would just hack notches in the tree and create a cup of sorts in the tree itself, so they could easily remove with like they had tools to remove the resin and transport it into barrels. Again, this is known as boxing, and you see the trough. There's those metal troughs they have in place there. Okay. All right. Here's another old photo, and on the right, you see they've created a cup out of the wood itself, so it drains directly. I mean, you don't have to have a separate appliance for that. Okay, and these are photos, old photos from Sampson County. This is probably taken about 1890, and of course, you know, after the war, after the Civil War, you had a lot of unemployed people, particularly blacks. And they found employment in the pine forest. You know, white and black, they might make $1 a day at best. Again, the gum resin, the resin collected, as I show here, the earliest is called virgin, and the virgin gum is preferable. It's better suited for their products. And as you can see, this particular tree has been worked for 4 or 5 years. You see how high those hack marks are. Okay, and after they collect the resin, they transport it into these large barrels. And again, the barrels were made by these fellows by the name of Coopers. I think I read that like of every 20 people engaged in the turpentine naval store industry, 5 or 6 were employed as barrel makers or coopers. All right, here's a man, what he's doing is scraping the hardened turpentine. Again, it has a further distance to go from where it bleeds all the way down to those troughs. It's known as scrape, and it hardens. And these fellows would have a tool called a scraper, obviously, just for that, because again, the gum would harden. Naval stores require the use of specialized products. I don't know the name of all these. I know the one on the left there beside the axe, again, is called a hack. And the one that's third from the right on the end is called a dipper. Okay, now this is a photo taken from Sampson County, from one of the farms of a fellow by the name of A.J. Johnson. He's having these barrels hauled to his distillery so they can process them into turpentine. A.J. Johnson lived right beside the Black River. And of course, I'll show you his steamboat shortly, but he would transport these processed barrels of turpentine and tar to Wilmington for shipment overseas. Okay, here's an old drawing of a turpentine distillery. Turpentine distillery, or stills as they call them, were identical to modern day liquor stills. So, I mean, there was the same thing, the same apparatus, built the same way. And of course, but the turpentine stills were made on a larger scale, capable of producing more turpentine. Okay, here's a steel, and you'd call this a naval store, what we're seeing right here. Now, the steel was there, but the yard, the whole thing would be called a naval store. And from here, it was probably being shipped, probably carried to a nearby river or creek for shipping down to Wilmington. And here's a worker pouring a newly distilled turpentine into a barrel, trying to get ready for shipping. And here's another one. This was located, I've got a second picture of this one coming up. This was a steel located by the Great Cohary Creek. It was located on what we call Boykins Bridge Road here outside of Clinton. And it's right beside Boykins Bridge. It sat beside the Great Cohary. And from the Great Cohary, they'd float it down to Black River. And from Black River, they'd ship it down to, by steamboat, down to Wilmington where it was sold. Okay, a few minutes ago, I was talking about rosin versus resin. Again, once the resin was distilled and turpentine was created, it was like a vapor, and it dropped into a vat and it was liquid. But the remnants of the resin would turn black and harden, and this was known as rosin. And of course, we get from rosin, we get, they grind it up. And of course, it's the same stuff that is used on violins. It's the same stuff that baseball players use for pitchers, but that's rosin. And of course, this is a rosin, what we see in a hardened form here. Okay, this is this place is called Boykins Bridge, and of course, it dates back well over 200 years. This particular bridge, and has some history behind it. But there was a steel distillery, and they'd stored their tar and turpentine there. From there, again, it was floated by barge down to what an area would call Clear Run, and from there taken down to Wilmington. But you can get an idea of just the size of it. This is an area that we still paddle on our kayaking trips and our friends group. It's kind of cool to see it today versus what I'm seeing right here. Okay, this is the steamboat Lisbon. Again, this was owned by businessman A.J. Johnson. Steamboat ferries were a big deal in the 1800s. Of course, they went away with the advent of the railroads later on. Again, this one was sunk in, I think it was 1914, and remnants of it can still be seen on the Black River. But they used these kind of vessels to haul naval stores down to Wilmington. Okay, here's a shot of Water Street in 1873. Again, North Carolina was a leading exporter of naval stores until after the Civil War. And this is a photo, well, again, from Water Street down in Wilmington. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's one of the streets closest to Cape Fear River there, the downtown area. All right, Worth was an agent for the Cape Fear Steamboat Company. This company specialized in cotton and naval stores. I think, yeah, okay. And most likely this boat that you're seeing came from Fayetteville. Now here's another company that's also dealt in cotton and naval stores, Vic and Mebane. These guys were in Wilmington. This vessel that they're loading is a German vessel, and they're loading with both tar and rosin. Okay. Of course, in the late 1800s, as you know, with the advent of the steamboats, the demand for sailing ships faded. And of course, when that faded, so did the demand for the wood and tar and turpentine and naval products and the longleaf pine. So it died a slow death. Okay. After this, there was a drop in demand for longleaf pine, and of course, farmland became more valuable than the pine trees themselves. So this led to widespread clearing of large tracts of land, of natural longleaf habitat throughout the South. So this further attributed to the demise of this longleaf forest. Okay. Restoration of longleaf pines of the forest had become a major conservation project. It thrills me to see new pines as I'm driving down the road. I don't know if you have any birders out there, or if you're familiar with the red cockaded woodpecker. You'll find those in certain places. Well, you only find red cockaded woodpeckers where you'll find longleaf pines, and there's certain tracts outside of Fort Bragg and Southern Pines where you'll find the red cockaded. But what's so unique is that the red cockaded woodpecker will drill its holes only in a longleaf pine, and it does so because the heart pine is soft enough for them to drill it out, and at the same time, the pine sap, the resin that drains out of it will cover the sides and make it difficult for certain animals to climb up, such as snakes, to climb into their nest. So again, that's how the red cockaded woodpecker benefits from longleaf pines. So, but again, anytime I have a chance to see longleaf pines, it just warms my heart, but it takes a concentrated effort on a lot of folks. So do I have any more, David? Do I have any more slides?
That's the last slide I have,
okay.
Joel.
Okay. Well, that's all that I have for right now.
Well, thank you so much.
You're quite welcome.
Question about naval stores. I have to share that I embarrassed myself yesterday on our check-in. I referred to them as naval stones. So thank you for clarifying that for me. We did have a few questions come in from the audience, and folks at home, feel free to add more using the Q&A tool here in Zoom. But this first question we had was in regards to one of the photos that you shared. It referred to a longleaf yellow pine. Why were they called yellow longleaf pines? Was that referencing the color of the inside of the tree?
I mean, the wood has a yellow tint to it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's my explanation. I mean, if you look at pine wood itself, pine lumber, it has a yellow tint to it, probably because of the resin and the sap.
That makes sense. Can you speak a bit about other products made from pine? One registrant mentioned soap being made from pine products.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, you can buy that. Of course, you can't find it at Food Line, but you can buy these products at specialty stores. I have a friend who makes pine soap, and sells it, but he sells it at trade shows, specialty shops, that sort of thing. But it can be bought. You can probably go to Amazon and find it real quick.
And I just saw in the chat someone shared longleaf is a species within the category of southern yellow pines. So that probably explains more about that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. This is a good one. Was there an industry or historic use of pine tree products before its use in ships and naval stores? This person's curious, how was resin and tar
I mean, again, you've got to remember too, David, that when we're talking about shipbuilding, I mean, you can go back to the Egyptians. So, and I don't know if I don't know where else the longleaf pine grows, but they would have had to have similar products from which they could draw the wood or the sap, for sailing vessels. But the only thing I can think of is for building sturdy structures. If sometimes you might read about houses that are discovered or being taken apart, disassembled, that might be 200 years old, and they'll find beams of this hard pine or longleaf pine beams that are fully intact and like they were put in yesterday. So these things are long lasting.
A good follow-up to that, does cutting pines repeatedly for resin collection reduce the expected lifespan of the tree?
Well, I think it obviously did. Now, and really there's no real large scale demand for resin any longer, unless it's commercially produced. But and they probably have other byproducts, but there's always demand for turpentine. But it's a separate industry now. But I would think, going back to looking at some of these large forests back in the heyday of the sailing ships, they were so plentiful, they probably start tapping this one, this one, this one. I mean, just as fast and as many as it could. And of course, after 5 or 6 years, and these trees were all tapped out, they die. And of course, now they are perfectly suited to be used to draw out the resin for the tar from it, So, but I don't know of any large scale going on right now. And again, there's such a dearth of longleaf pines in North Carolina. It's not really an issue anymore, I don't think.
This is maybe a really good question for you as a director of a history museum. But is it possible to find the names of turpentine workers or naval store, workers?
Well, I mean, like here in Sampson County, we find a lot of we can identify, looking at some of the old photos, the owners of them. Okay, we know who owned them. Now, as far as the individuals, that's a little more difficult. Now, there are some photos that I showed you that had the names of some of those, some of the workers, like some of the black workers, the old black and white photos. I remember one of them was Isaac Boykin was one of the names. Another one was a James Izell. And, we could probably go back through census records and ancestry.com and figure out who some of these people are and who some of their descendants are today.
Back to the naval store products. You mentioned a lot of these were shipped overseas.
Yeah.
Were the products needed in other countries more than the U.S. needed them?
Oh, well, the U.S. was, the colonies were supplying this. I think they'd send them to anybody who had the money.
Sure.
Okay. And again, if you got to think about it, this only a small percentage of North America was inhabited by the colonies. So there probably wasn't that much demand as it was as in populated cities.
Sure. Are there ways other countries could have produced these products, without having access to the longleaf pine?
Well, again, I don't know if going back, I mentioned how, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, you saw the Egyptians were sailing, building boats, Chinese built them, India. And so there are obviously similar products out there or comparable products. When I say products, I mean resources that would provide the same kind of items needed for building ships.
Gosh, so many questions have come in since we started.
You go on.
Keep them coming. Thank you, everyone. Okay, I understand the Kohari tribe has been doing great work to clear and
Oh, yeah.
restore the Great Kohari River.
Yeah.
Has this work revealed any new historic info about the naval stores industry?
One thing that you'll find out, the Coharies or some of the Coharies are deeply involved with our friends of the Sampson County Waterways Group. I mean, we work in conjunction. And again, one of the things that when we started 20 years ago, 25 years ago, one of the projects was to keep our rivers open. And when I say, well, we've only got one river. No, we got two rivers in this county, and they're not very wide. Now, Black River gets wider as you get in toward Wilmington and Cape Fear. But some of these channels are very small and not very wide. And if you go back to colonial days, even look at court records, just like we have to do jury duty today, we're called on for jury duty. Back then, people were called on for road work, but they were also called on to help clear the rivers, the creeks. Because again, we're talking about naval stores, which were a great source of income for these people. And so they had to have access to Wilmington to float these products. Now today, I don't know if you know where Newton Grove is, up in the northern part of the county, just off I-40. But the Great Kohari originally went all the way to Newton Grove. And people, even back then, could float their products down to Wilmington, although it's no telling how far it is going by the river, a winding river, probably 150 miles. But they could go from there down to Wilmington just using the waterways. Now today, from Newton Grove even to Clinton is almost impossible to float down. It's like the Great Kohari is just like a little stream now at best. But again, going back to clearing up the waterways, since the hurricanes have come about in recent years, Hurricane, was it Florence just a few years ago, Matthew, one of the problems that all the trees that fall in, and so the state and the national government, the federal government has provided money for removing a lot of these downed trees that are blocking the rivers. So, and not only removing these trees out of the water, but like some of our group and the Coharies will go through and using chainsaws, just cut the logs and debris that's in the way. So, I mean, but we work together. Philip Bell is kind of leads that. He calls it the Kohari Initiative, and he does a great job. That he's working with a lot of Kohari youth. And by the way, the Coharies are part of the Tuscaroras, and they're not a federally recognized tribe. They're state recognized. So, I mean, they don't get federal monies, and but they distinguish themselves clearly from the Lumbees of Robinson County.
Thank you for that info. What are longleaf pine needles used for today?
Floors. Okay. I mean, floors. Yeah, I think anything, you've got those two types of wood, but the most important wood is the hardwood. Okay. So, I don't know what kind of demand there is like for building products. And again, there's probably ample supply. They find these logs in rivers, maybe that fell off a boat 150 years ago. And there's a company out of Whiteville, I believe it is, that all they do is dredge places on the Cape Fear River and remove these old logs that have fell in that were being transported. And from those logs, water soaked logs, they'll eventually convert them into hard pine boards. So.
All right, I have a question about scoring the pine for resin collection. How deep are the cuts?
Well, they're not deep enough to get into the hard pine. Okay, they stay on the sapwood, and but they don't want to harm the heart pine. So,
Sure.
you know, I mean, they can create, and depending upon the size of the tree, they can create a cup, you know, out of like a little bowl out of the tree itself, where the sap would collect, the resin would collect.
And how often are the cuts cleaned out?
Well, it depends upon how often. I mean, you probably, if you, now again, we're talking about 150 years ago, all right?
Mm-hmm.
So I can imagine if you had a large pine forest, it's just a matter of how many you've got. And you go from, you know, to tree to tree to tree, and dipping and filling your bucket with the pine sap, with the resin. So I don't know how long it would take. Again, you know, a tree would last 8 or 10 years. You know, I've got photos of they're working on the trees 12, 15 high with ladders, with 12, 15 up. But again, I think at a certain point, the trees would begin to die. And again, that's when they would start harvesting for the resin for tar.
Sure. Well, thank you. I think that just about covers most of the questions. There has been.
The heels.
Go ahead.
The tar heels.
Oh,
So-
yes, that was up here. Yes. Go ahead. Go
The
ahead.
whole idea is that, you know, these people that worked around a tar kiln, okay, or worked in the naval store industry. You know, if you're working around a tar kiln, this stuff is going to flow all over the ground, you know, toward and to drain. But so anybody stepping in it, working in it, is probably going to get tar on their shoes, okay, and it doesn't come off easily. So, you know, if you're working in the naval store industry and you had some shoes that were probably loaded with tar, okay, so it refers to those people who worked in the naval store industry from North Carolina. Enough said there.
Absolutely. And there were some conversations happening in the chat about how other countries produce naval store products. One person mentioned that there are pines all over the world, such as, you know, China and Portugal, that had major navies that were producing their own products using the pines that were available to them. I've also seen pine needles today are used by the nursery industry for mulch. And it's actually helping to fund forest restoration across the Southeast. Pine straw, again, is also used as a mulch.
More desirable.
And I think that's all we have for questions. If we have any more, we'll send them your way, Joel, and we can
That's
share
fine.
those responses
Okay.
via email. But I'll invite Joanna back on for some closing words. Thank you again, Joel.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Joel, thank you so much. This was really some wonderful information to have, and I've seen so many questions in the Q&A. Is a very hot topic here, and I think longleaf pines in general are a very hot topic relative to the work we do at the garden, and we do hope to offer more exhibition type talks and classes in the future about longleaf pines. I know there's a lot of excitement about that. Thank you again so much, and we want to encourage you, if you're not a current member of the garden or the Friends of Plant Conservation, please consider joining as a member, and membership is really critical to both of our missions. And thank you all for attending. Look forward to seeing you at the garden and at our future talks. Have a wonderful day.